What's going on there, YouTube, and welcome back to another comic book video. This is the channel where we sit down and cover different comic book stories from different comic book companies. Today, we are going to jump back over to Marvel Comics, and we are going to cover Hobgoblin Lives. This story is actually very important, and the reason why is because when it comes to Hobgoblin in the 1980s and the 1990s, Marvel kept us guessing on who was the Hobgoblin. At first, we had no idea, and then Marvel said it was Ned Leeds, and then after Ned Leeds, it was Jason McIndale. Well, after those two characters, this book came out and said no, there was someone else who was the Hobgoblin, and this clears up a lot of mess that Marvel did over the years when it came to the Hobgoblin character. And so I do hope you enjoy today's comic book video, and if you do, hit that like button down below and subscribe. But here we go, Hobgoblin Lives. In Hobgoblin Lives Part 1, we actually pick up with Peter Parker having a nightmare. Now the reason why he is having this nightmare is because when Peter Parker first found out who was the Hobgoblin, he found out it was Ned Leeds. Remember, Marvel told us that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin, but here is another thing. Jason McIndale, the second Hobgoblin supposedly, actually hired someone known as the Foreigner to kill off Ned Leeds, and then Jason became the new Hobgoblin in the 90s. But when Peter Parker found out that Ned Leeds, one of his close friends, the husband to Betty Brant, was the Hobgoblin, it broke him. And then when he found out why he became the Hobgoblin, well, the original story said he became Hobgoblin because Betty Brant had so many nightmares because she lost her brother and her father thanks to Peter Parker being Spider-Man. And so with that happening, Ned Leeds supposedly got tired of that and was angry for his wife, and so decided to go after and kill Spider-Man. That was the reason of why Ned Leeds became Hobgoblin. But as we go through this story, you're going to find out that is not technically true. Now, I should mention that this story actually takes place right after the Clone Saga. And if you don't know what the Clone Saga is, it was one of Marvel's worst ideas back in the 90s because what should have been a short story took forever to finish, so many years. But either way though, at the end of that storyline, Norman Osborn came back to life. He was supposedly never dead, and Mary Jane lost the baby. And so this tells us that, hey, this takes place right after that, because Peter Parker brings up those things to remind us this does take place right after the Clone Saga. Now, we actually do jump over to Betty Brant, and this is very important because Betty Brant was the wife to Ned Leeds. And the thing was, when she first found out that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin, she couldn't believe it. Even when she had the proof in front of her, she still couldn't believe her husband was the Hobgoblin. Now, later on, she began to remember different things about her husband dressed as the Hobgoblin. And so when we pick up with her, she is having a nightmare because she's remembering her husband dressed as the Hobgoblin, and that is so messed up for her, but at the same time she really has no choice but to move on. It's so hard for her. Now, the reason why Peter Parker, Betty Brant, and Mary Jane are having these nightmares will be explained down the road here in a moment. Now, we actually do jump over to a character known as Jacob Conover. Now, Jacob Conover is a small-time character. He only appeared a few times in both Spider-Man and also Daredevil comics here and there. But he was a small-time reporter for the Daily Bugle. Now, before he was let go from the Daily Bugle, he was actually working on a story about corruption in different corporations across New York City. But here's the thing, Ned Leeds actually borrowed his files, but when it came time for Jacob to get those files back, those files went missing. And of course, Jacob kind of blames Ned Leeds. Now, the reason why he is also important is because Ned Leeds has some kind of connection to this character. And so we do jump over to Jonah Jameson. And this is actually very important because when it comes to Jonah Jameson, He had no idea that Ned Leeds is Hobgoblin. Matter of fact, up to this moment right here, he still doesn't know that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin. And so he still feels bad about the death of Ned Leeds. And the reason why, because he thinks that if he had never sent Ned Leeds to cover the story about who was the Hobgoblin, or sent him to Germany like he did in the Spider-Man versus Wolverine storyline, Ned Leeds could possibly be alive right now. JJ has no idea that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin. Now, the reason why everyone is thinking about Ned Leeds is because Jason McIndale, the second Hobgoblin, is on trial right now for all the crimes he did as the Hobgoblin. Now remember, not everyone knows that Jason McIndale is actually the second Hobgoblin. To most people, they believe he was the only Hobgoblin. But either way though, of course, Jason McIndale does get the guilty charge, so he is going to jail for his crimes. But while he's being taken out of the courthouse and you have all these different news channels covering this, well, that is the moment he tells the whole world that he was the second Hobgoblin. He tells the world that Betty Brant's husband, Ned Leeds, was the first Hobgoblin. And he says this by pointing at her because Betty Brant and Peter Parker are both there because, hey, they work for who? The Daily Bugle. But of course, with him saying that, everyone's like, wait, what? Ned Leeds was the first Hobgoblin? And now everyone is looking at Betty Brant and they want to ask her so many questions. And so with Jason McIndale saying that, you now have every single reporter, cameraman, whoever works for a news channel look at Betty Brant and kind of like, hey, we need some answers. Is it true that your husband was the first Hobgoblin? Like, this is breaking news. And so of course you now have a crowd of people chasing her down. Now luckily Peter Parker is there with her and he is able to actually help her get away by going to a nearby fire escape, froze there, and telling her, you run, I'll hold the door. Now in reality, the reason why he is holding the door is because he is Spider-Man. He has super strength. He can hold the door all day. But he wanted to give Betty Brant enough time to get downstairs so he could run upstairs and actually change into his Spider-Man outfit so that he can go back down and actually pick her up and take her away, because this crowd will not stop chasing her until they get what they want. It's actually questions or answers to the idea that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin. Now remember, when it comes to Peter Parker being Spider-Man, Betty Brant doesn't know that. She has no idea that a close friend of hers is actually Spider-Man. And so he has to pretend he has no idea what happened down there at the courthouse. And so of course, she has to tell him everything he already knows, but it's so hard for Peter Parker to pretend that he has no idea because he's afraid to tell her that he is Spider-Man. And so with Jason McIndale telling the whole world about him being the second Hobgoblin, it gets played over and over again on live television. And with that, we actually jump over to Senator Bob Martin and George Vandergill. Now, George Vandergill is actually more important than Bob. And the reason why is because, remember, in one of our earlier videos, Hobgoblin actually tried to blackmail a bunch of different rich people. Of course, one of those people was George Vandergill. And so Bob is asking George, how do you feel about the trial of Jason McIndale, especially now saying that he was the second Hobgoblin, not the first, just trying to mess with his friend here to make him angry. Now we do jump over to Donald Minkin. Now Donald Minkin, I want to say, was originally the personal assistant to Harry Osborn, or it could have been Norman, but I want to say it was Harry. But either way though, Donald right now is actually one of the chair members of Oscorp Industries. But here's the thing, when Donald hears the news about Jason McIndale saying Ned Leeds was the first Hobgoblin, Donald is excited because he's kind of like, that could actually hurt the stock of the Daily Bugle, meaning that he could buy some stock in the Daily Bugle. But then he gets a phone call about how apparently there could be a takeover for Oscorp, meaning that other companies are trying to buy Oscorp out. We then get another set of characters who are worried about Ned Leeds being the Hobgoblin, and that is the Kingsley brothers, which is Roderick Kingsley and Daniel Kingsley. Now, we actually met Roderick Kingsley in our very first video of the Hobgoblin. And back in the early days of Marvel Comics, Marvel was saying that Roderick Kingsley was the Hobgoblin. And then at the last minute, when it came to Spider-Man versus Wolverine, they said no, it was Ned Leeds. But Daniel Kingsley, this is his first full appearance. He was only heard about once in the past when it came to Marvel Comics. But Daniel is freaking out because if people begin to investigate Ned Leeds' past life, it could lead right back to the Kingsley brothers. And honestly, that could be a bad thing for them. Now, Marvel gives us another small-time character, and that one is Jonas Harold. Now, Jonas Harold is a character that gives other characters different implants to make them stronger to fight against heroes like Hammerhead and Kangaroo. But the reason why we're focusing on him is because he was able to look at different videos of Spider-Man fighting against Hobgoblin, and he can tell right off the bat that what Jason McIndale was saying is true, because the fighting style between the two Hobgoblins are very different. And so it's him saying, yeah, Jason's right. Ned Leeds was the first Hobgoblin, and Jason is the second Hobgoblin. But then we jump over to the Daily Bugle, and there's a good reason why, because we pick up with JJ, and remember what I said earlier. JJ had no idea that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin. For him, he thought the reason why Ned died is because he let Ned chase that story in Germany, and that got him killed. But in reality, it was because he was the Hobgoblin. And so Betty Brant and Peter Parker are there to say, yeah, it's true. Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin. And for JJ, he just can't believe that. He's like, wait, one of my people was a villain? He was the Hobgoblin? But of course, you have JJ tell Robbie, we have to print. We print the truth. So let's print the truth and let's put it out there that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin. Now, you actually have Peter Parker go home to Mary Jane, and this moment right here is very important because you have Mary Jane point out, if Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin, why was he so easily defeated by 4 regular assassins that worked for the Foreigner? And you have Peter Parker realize his wife is correct. If Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin, he should have been able to defend himself and actually get away, and those guys should have been dead. And the reason why, because remember, in our earlier videos, Ned Leeds, if he was the Hobgoblin, he went almost to every single Oscorp building looking for Norman Osborn Green Goblin formula to give him enhanced strength, which means if he had used that, he should have had enhanced strength, and that should have gave him the edge over those assassins. Matter of fact, one of the assassins broke his arm, and that should have not happened if he had enhanced strength. And so you have Peter Parker and Mary Jane realize Ned Leeds was not the first Hobgoblin. Matter of fact, he could have been set up. And so with that, we actually jump over to Jason McIndale. And this moment right here is very important because Jason McIndale is sitting in prison thinking that, okay, well, I'm in jail now. The world knows I was Hobgoblin. I got the guilty charge. I'll stay in here. But then he was confronted by a random man. Now for Jason, he's kind of like, you should not be in here. There are guards everywhere. And you have this random man say, don't worry, the guards are okay. They're all taken care of. They're all knocked out. And then you have Jason McIndale realize or recognize the voice of this man. And that tells him that this man was actually the first Hobgoblin, not Ned Leeds. And so it's Marvel saying Ned Leeds was not the first Hobgoblin. And then this man right here, who is actually the first Hobgoblin, goes on to kill Jason Macendale. Bam, just like that, Jason is now dead. And then you have our real Hobgoblin actually change out of his disguise into his regular Hobgoblin outfit and continue his mission of being the Hobgoblin. We then pick up with Roderick Kingsley, and the reason why is because you have Roderick Kingsley right now having some nightmares or bad flashbacks of when he used to work with the Hobgoblin. Now, it wasn't like he wanted to, he was kind of forced to work with the Hobgoblin. But thanks to him working with the Hobgoblin, it actually got him shot thanks to one of the bad deals the Hobgoblin made. And so you have Roderick kind of happy that he's not dealing with the idea of working with the Hobgoblin no more. But of course, that is the moment where you actually have Hobgoblin appear and say, hey Roderick, you and I are going to work together one more time, and you really have no choice here. But when we jump over to Hobgoblin Lives Part 2, we actually pick up with Roderick Kingsley meeting up with Hobgoblin at some random warehouse. Now, while the two of them are talking, you actually have Hobgoblin mention a device known as the Wrinkler process device. And this is very important, but I am not going to explain what it is until we get to the very end. And the reason why is because this device is really explained very well at the very end of the story. But either way, you have Hobgoblin tell Roderick Kingsley that they have a lot to do and they must begin now. But while they're talking to each other, you actually have Hobgoblin change clothes into his regular person. But we have no idea who it is because, again, the comic book wants you to guess who could be the Hobgoblin. But we then jump over to the Daily Bugle, and we actually pick up with J. Jonah Jameson, Robbie, Peter Parker, and also Betty Brant, because they got footage of what happened to Jason Macendale. Of course, whoever is the real Hobgoblin just killed Jason Macendale in prison, and so of course they're watching the film and they realize that, hey, Ned Leeds couldn't been the Hobgoblin. That means Ned Leeds was set up. And so you actually have JJ tell everyone to get to work on trying to figure out who could be the real Hobgoblin. Now, the one person he does not want out there in the field is Betty Brant, because Ned Leeds is her husband, or was her husband, sorry, he's dead. But he was her husband. And so JJ feels like if she goes out there and try to learn more about who tried to set up her husband, one, she could possibly get killed, or two, it could actually break her because she has gone through so much, losing her brother, losing her husband. This right here could actually break her. Now, honestly, it doesn't stop Betty Brant, and for a good reason. Why? Because that was her husband who was killed because he was framed or set up to believe to be the Hobgoblin. And on top of that, the world was left to believe he actually was the first Hobgoblin. And so now it is her wanting to clear his name. It just makes sense that she does not want to sit on the sideline. But once she is outside, Peter Parker was able to quickly change into his Spider-Man outfit and then ask Betty Brant for them two to team up, but to also work with Peter Parker because, again, remember, Betty Brant has no idea that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. But either way, you have Peter Parker, or Spider-Man, sorry, and Betty Brant agree to work together to figure out who is the Hobgoblin and why did they use Ned Leeds for. Now we actually jump over to Donald Minkin meeting up with Roderick Kingsley, and the reason why is because these two characters are actually plotting to use a series of shell corporations to make it look like Osborn Industries is at risk of a corporate takeover. That's when they will have Kingsley International come in and actually appear to save the company. This is a way for them to cover up their illegal money laundering. Now, at the same time, that is when Minkin gets a phone call from George Vandergill, and he says that he knows about their plans, and he says he won't tell the police, but if they want him to keep their secret, they need to give him some kind of money, some kind of cut in their deal. And so really, he's just blackmailing them. Now we actually do jump over to Peter Parker being Spider-Man and actually meeting up with Flash Thompson. Now remember, at this point, Flash Thompson has no idea that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, but at the same time, Flash is still a huge fan of Spider-Man. But either way, you have Spider-Man actually ask Flash Thompson to help out to figure out who set up Ned Leeds to make the world believe that he was the Hobgoblin. Now, of course, Flash is down for two reasons. One, because originally Flash was also framed to believe that he was the Hobgoblin, even though he wasn't. And so he kind of wants revenge on whoever set him up as well. But at the same time, Flash feels really bad for Betty Brant. At the same time, Flash did kind of have some feelings for Betty Brant. And so he wants to help her so badly. He says yes to Spider-Man. Now, at the end of that section, we actually see Bob Martin and also we see Vandergill talking to one another. And the reason why, because remember, George Vandergill just made a deal with Donald and Roderick Kingsley to get a cut in their illegal money laundering. And he's telling his friend about the deal. But while he is on the phone talking to Bob Martin, somebody is attacking his factory, just blowing it up left and right. And he is wondering who is doing this and why they are doing this. And of course, we know who it is. It's the Hobgoblin. And remember, like I said earlier, when it comes to George and the Hobgoblin, they have a small past with one another because in one of our earlier videos, Hobgoblin tried to blackmail George, and of course Spider-Man stopped that. But either way though, this is Hobgoblin coming here and just destroying the factory that belongs to George. But to make it even worse, he actually ends up killing George off. You're like, oh my gosh. What is the real plan for the Hobgoblin? Now, of course, word gets out very quickly that Hobgoblin killed George Vandergill, and different people hears the news about what happened to him. JJ hears about it, so does Donald, and of course, Betty Brant and Spider-Man hears about it as well. But getting on to Betty Brant and Spider-Man, remember, these two characters are working together to figure out who set up Ned Leeds. And so you have Spider-Man change into Peter Parker and actually meet up with Mary Jane on the first floor so that they can walk back upstairs and help Betty Brant figure out, again, who set up Ned Leeds. Now, Flash Thompson is also there as well. And so these four characters are going to look at different people very closely to see if it could be they are the Hobgoblin. After a while, you have each character, Mary Jane, Peter Parker, Flash, and also Betty, all realize that they have a different person on their mind that could possibly be the Hobgoblin. Now, we are only going to focus on Mary Jane. And the reason why is because Mary Jane actually is shocked to see that Kingsley was on the list of people who could possibly be the Hobgoblin. And so what she is going to do is actually contact Kingsley to talk to him to see if he is the Hobgoblin. And the reason why she is so close to Roderick Kingsley is because she used to model for him. Remember, Roderick Kingsley is actually a fashion person. And so for Mary Jane, she is wondering if it's true that Roderick could be the Hobgoblin. Now, while everyone is leaving the apartment of Betty Brant, no one realized that Jacob Conover was actually outside the apartment. He was staking out the place. Why? Well, we're going to find out down the road. Now you have Peter Parker go meet up with Ben Urich. Of course, Ben Urich is one of the best reporters at the Daily Bugle at this time and a close friend of Peter Parker. Now you actually have Peter Parker think that it could be Jonas Harold. Remember, Jonas Harold is the guy who used to give other supervillains implants to make them stronger, like Hammerhead and Kangaroo. But the reason why Peter Parker thinks it could be Jonas is because as soon as Jonas got out on parole, he disappeared. No one has seen him. And on top of that, Jonas does have connections to Roxxon. Now, if you are new to Marvel, Roxxon is one of those companies that has their hands in a lot of illegal things. And of course, everyone knows that. And so Peter Parker thinks that Roxxon possibly has some kind of connection with Jonas. Jonas could be the Hobgoblin, and the reason why they got rid of George earlier is because, again, they could take over his company. But Ben is kind of like, I don't know, this is a good idea, but at the same time, there could be more to this. But then we jump over to Flash Thompson, who is meeting up with Liz Allen. Now remember, Liz Allen was actually married to Harry Osborn, but at this point in Marvel Comics, Harry was dead. And matter of fact, she now runs Oscorp as the main person in charge. There are other people on the board with her, but she is the main one. But Flash came here to see if possibly anyone on her board could be the Hobgoblin. And of course, she does mention one name. Well, she was about to, except someone runs in to tell her that something's going on at the New Jersey factory for Oscorp. And when we actually jump over to the factory, well, we see that Hobgoblin is blowing the place up like no other. And the question is now, why is Hobgoblin attacking here? Well, we learn the next page, because actually you have Peter Parker and Ben Urich arrive to see what happened here, and Flash is also there. And the reason why Flash is there because Liz Allen actually told Flash a name of someone on the board who could be the Hobgoblin. That person is Donald Minkin. Remember, he's one of the board members that actually was working with Roderick Kingsley earlier. Except with this factory being blown up, the question is, where is Donald? Because he is not here, or there, sorry. He is not there. And so now we are supposed to believe that Donald could be the Hobgoblin. Now, for Betty Brant, she believes it could possibly be the Senator Bob Martin. And so you actually have her go and see him, except when she gets there, he is so scared and freaking out that he does not want to even talk to her, and so he leaves just like that. Now, for Betty Brant, she's getting tired of trying to figure out who is the Hobgoblin, and so her next step was to go to do an interview on live television and tell the world that she actually has notes from her husband that he left behind that tells the truth on who is the Hobgoblin, but also clears his name. Now, these files are not actually real, but the reason why she did that is because whoever is the Hobgoblin is going to freak out and actually try to get those files and could possibly slip up to reveal who is the Hobgoblin. But either way, once she does leave the meeting, Jacob Conover comes out of nowhere and corners her in a taxi. And you have to remember, when it comes to Jacob Conover, he actually used to work at the Daily Bugle, but he was let go. But before he was let go, he let Ned Leeds borrow a bunch of files for one of his big stories, but then the files just magically disappeared. And so for Jacob, he believes the files that Betty has could be his old files that could get him his job back or a new job somewhere else. But of course, she is saved by Spider-Man, and we move forward on from this moment. Now, of course, with Betty Brant going on live television and telling the world that she has some files that could tell the world who is the Hobgoblin, but also clear her husband's name, she does get attacked by the Hobgoblin. Now, with her being attacked by him, of course, Spider-Man was still there, and that begins an old school battle between these two characters. And honestly, it is a pretty good fight, but of course, we have to move on to jump into the final issue of this storyline. And so you have Hobgoblin actually be able to defeat Spider-Man because his new glider, or his regular glider, has a bunch of new upgrades that was able to easily defeat Spider-Man, making Spider-Man fall in the river as Hobgoblin flies away. And so of course that means now Betty Brant is up for grabs. Now we finally reach Hobgoblin Lives number 3. Now with us reaching this issue, of course, it is going to be the book that actually tells us who is the Hobgoblin. But before we are actually able to learn who is the Hobgoblin, we pick up with Spider-Man, who is still drowning because he lost a battle against the Hobgoblin. And while he is drowning, he is actually thinking, who could be the Hobgoblin? There were so many people who could possibly be the Hobgoblin. But after a while, he realized that he is drowning and he realized he needs to get out of the water, and so he does. But after doing that, that is when he realized that Betty Brant could now be in trouble because Hobgoblin is free and wandering around the city. Speaking of Betty Brant, we actually pick up with her right now, and the police actually bring her back over to her apartment thinking that she'll be safe there and they can protect her. Of course, we all know that is not going to work. And matter of fact, it doesn't work because you have the Hobgoblin being able to just walk right in, knock out all the guards and Betty Brant, thanks to him using some kind of pumpkin gas, and he was able to grab Betty Brant. Now, this is very important because this Hobgoblin is showing that he is very upset that Betty Brant could possibly have files about him. But then he gets even more upset when he finds out on the news that Spider-Man did not die after their battle. Now, you do have Spider-Man get back over to Betty Brant's apartment, hoping to save her from Hobgoblin. But when he gets there, of course, she is already gone. And so he begins to freak out. And the cops do tell him that it was Hobgoblin who did take her because they found some clues that do point that it was Hobgoblin that did take her. But either way, you do have Spider-Man remember that he did place a spider tracer on Betty Brant just in case he needs to find her. And so of course, he's going to use his powers as a way to locate the spider tracer that he had placed on her to go find her. But unfortunately, when it comes to Hobgoblin, he knows about Spider-Man's spider tracer, and that is the moment where we actually see him find both spider tracers that Spider-Man had placed on Betty Brant just in case she did get kidnapped. And so with that, of course, that means now Spider-Man is going to have a hard time finding Betty Brant. And so you actually have Betty Brant begin to interview the Hobgoblin. Now this is actually very important because she wants to learn how Ned Leeds got involved in all of this mess, but at the same time hoping to learn who is the Hobgoblin. Now you actually have Hobgoblin say that back when Spider-Man and him was fighting in that battle van of his, like they did in one of our earlier videos, and when that van fell into the river, both characters were able to escape the van before it blew up. But the thing was, Spider-Man only found the mask of Hobgoblin, and he thought that possibly he was dead. Of course, he wasn't. You have this Hobgoblin say that he stayed hidden in the shadows as a way to make sure no one saw who he was. But on his way back to his base, that is when he realized that someone was following him. Of course, that someone was Ned Leeds, because Ned Leeds was assigned by JJ to figure out who was the Hobgoblin. Now this is the moment where you actually have Hobgoblin explain what is the Wrinkler process machine. And I told y'all I would tell you what it does later on. Well, here is the moment. You have Hobgoblin tell us that the Wrinkler process machine is really just a brainwashing machine. And he used this same machine actually on Ned Leeds to brainwash him. And he did use some drugs as well. But it was all done as a way to control Ned Leeds to be a step-in Hobgoblin so that Ned Leeds can give this Hobgoblin some better connections in the underground world. Now, here is some more big things about Ned Leeds. Because the drugs and the brainwashing, it really did have a bad effect on Ned Leeds. And matter of fact, you have this Hobgoblin say, Betty Brant should remember, because he did become more aggressive. He was always angry all the time. And again, because thanks to brainwashing and the drugs, he became that person. He wanted to be the Hobgoblin, but at the same time, he was still trying to be a good reporter. And so this is the moment that actually ties into Spider-Man versus Wolverine, because you have this Hobgoblin say, I had Ned Leeds go over to the Kingpin to trade information so that Ned Leeds could get a story to follow all the way out to Germany. That is how Ned Leeds got word of what was going on in Germany back in the Spider-Man versus Wolverine. he got all his information from the Kingpin. And it was this Hobgoblin trying to keep him busy. Now, once Peter Parker and Ned Leeds got to Germany for that story, well, Ned Leeds found a package for him in his hotel. Of course, it was this Hobgoblin who left him a package, and in that package was Ned Leeds' Hobgoblin outfit. But once Ned Leeds put that outfit on, we know he was attacked by a bunch of assassins. And this is when you have this Hobgoblin say, I was the one who basically got Ned Leeds killed, because I let it leak out that Ned Leeds was actually Hobgoblin as a way to go ahead and get rid of him. So it wasn't Jason Macendale and Foreigner just magically figuring out that Ned Leeds was Hobgoblin. It was this Hobgoblin who let information get out to Jason Macendale and the Foreigner that Ned Leeds was Hobgoblin. But then this is the moment where you actually have Hobgoblin realize that Betty Brant doesn't have any files about him at all, that she made everything up. And so with that, he's kind of like, okay, well, now I have to kill you because first off, you lied to me. Secondly, you now know everything about Ned Leeds and me, so I need to get rid of you. But that is when you have Roderick Kingsley walk in with the gun and saying, you cannot kill her because she did nothing wrong. And he's actually trying to stand up to the Hobgoblin. Now, you do have Spider-Man actually appear at the right time to save Betty Brant, because there was one more spider tracer Betty Brant had, and it was in the tape recorder. But either way, you actually have Spider-Man begin the process of fighting against the Hobgoblin. But before he followed the Hobgoblin, he did web up Roderick Kingsley. And so while Spider-Man is fighting against Hobgoblin, you have Betty Brant begin to ask more questions to Roderick Kingsley to figure out what is going on, who is the real Hobgoblin. And this is the moment where we finally learn who is the Hobgoblin, because while Spider-Man is fighting against the Hobgoblin, Betty Brant realized that Roderick Kingsley's hair on the top is fake. And when she removes it, we come to find out it's Daniel Kingsley. Daniel Kingsley was pretending to be Roderick Kingsley, which means that Spider-Man must be fighting possibly his twin brother. And voila, when Spider-Man pulls off that mask, we come to find out that Roderick Kingsley was the Hobgoblin. This whole time, he was the Hobgoblin because all he wanted was some power. And of course, he lost. Now, of course, with the world finding out that Roderick Kingsley was the Hobgoblin and Spider-Man being able to actually defeat him, that means that this Hobgoblin, Roderick Kingsley, has to go to jail. And when he gets to his prison cell, well, he finds a tape recorder. And really, it's just Spider-Man making fun of Roderick Kingsley being in prison now. And so you actually have the story end on that note right there. Everyone is excited for what they did. They were able to lock up the real Hobgoblin and clear the name of Ned Leeds. And so with that, that is where we are going to end today's comic book video. So please hit the like button down below and subscribe. Also, if you have any suggestions on books I should read, well, please let me know in the comments below, because you never know, your suggestion could be a future video down the road. But I do hope you enjoy today's comic book video.